April 1861. The Civil War had just begun tearing America apart. While men in Virginia and Tennessee were picking sides and loading rifles to fight for their beliefs, a different kind of man was making a different kind of choice. He wasn't choosing North or South. He was choosing neither. He was deserting, and he needed somewhere so remote, so brutal, so completely forgotten by civilization that no military authority would ever come looking. He found it in a narrow canyon carved into the Nevada desert along the Colorado River, a place where gold ran through the walls. The nearest sheriff sat 200 miles north, and murder happened so regularly that nobody even bothered reporting it. This is the story of Eldorado Canyon, the settlement that became Nelson, Nevada, and the most lawless place the American West ever produced. Gold and silver had been discovered in Eldorado Canyon around 1859 when prospectors first entered the remote terrain along the Colorado River. 2 years later, in 1861, a Mojave chief named Irataba directed a prospector named John Moss to a particularly rich silver vein buried deep in the canyon walls. Moss staked his claim immediately. News traveled fast across the Pacific coast, and within months men were flooding into the canyon from California, Arizona, and beyond. They came because the canyon promised wealth. They stayed because it promised something equally valuable to certain kinds of men: complete anonymity. The Paiute people who inhabited the surrounding desert hills had a word for the hungry. The miners who established the canyon's most productive operation used that word for their mine. The Tacatacup mine took its name from two Paiute words meaning hungry and bread, a name that described the starving Paiute people who came to the mining camps desperately seeking food. Oh, the irony ran deep. The canyon was extracting extraordinary wealth from the earth, while the people who had lived there for generations went hungry at its edges. The Tacatacup mine eventually extracted several $1 million in gold, silver, copper, and lead from its tunnels. It became the foundation around which everything else in the canyon was built. By 1861, the canyon contained 4 separate settlements. At the canyon's upper end sat San Juan, later called Upper Camp, near what became the town of Nelson. Midway down the canyon stood Alturas and Louisville, clustered near the Tacatacup mine. At the canyon's mouth, along the Colorado River, sat Colorado City, the steamboat landing where ore went out and supplies came in. Steamboats loaded with equipment and provisions traveled up the Colorado from Yuma, Arizona, delivering everything the canyon's growing population needed to continue extracting gold from the desert walls. The Civil War transformed the canyon's character completely. When fighting erupted between North and South in April 1861, soldiers from both armies began deserting. These men needed to disappear, and Eldorado Canyon was perfectly suited to that purpose. The canyon sat so far from military jurisdiction that no reasonable commanding officer would dispatch troops to retrieve deserters when actual battles demanded every available man. Bluecoats and graycoats, who had already been shooting at each other in other states, found themselves digging side by side in Nevada, equally invested in staying invisible. The factions these deserters brought with them didn't disappear when they crossed into the canyon. Union sympathizers established a camp called Buster Falls. Confederate sympathizers settled in a camp called Lucky Jim, located just a mile down the canyon. The Civil War that was playing out across thousands of miles of American territory played out in miniature across a few hundred yards of Nevada Canyon. The strife between these factions severely disrupted mining and mill operations. Men who should have been extracting gold were managing grudges that no authority existed to settle. That absence of authority defined everything about Eldorado Canyon. The nearest sheriff held his office in Pioche, 200 miles north. A week's hard riding separated any lawman from whatever was happening in the canyon. Murder, according to local accounts from the period, wasn't considered serious enough to justify that journey. A killing in Eldorado Canyon was a local matter, settled locally or not settled at all. If a man shot his partner over a disputed claim boundary and then continued working the claim, the matter was effectively closed. No court would convene. No jury would deliberate. The surviving man's continued possession of the claim constituted the only verdict available. Ownership of the Tecaticup mine drove the worst violence. The mine changed hands multiple times through combinations of legal maneuver and armed force, and the distinction between the two wasn't always clear. According to accounts from the period, the Tecaticup was established through a series of transactions that at least some parties considered fraudulent from the beginning. When the mine's ownership was disputed, the dispute didn't go to a courthouse. It went to whoever had more men with loaded rifles. Gunfights over the Tecaticup became almost routine. In the worst periods, killings in Eldorado Canyon approached a daily occurrence. Miners worked the Tecaticup's tunnels under conditions that tested endurance in every respect. In 1861, workers discovered the salvage vein, a rich ribbon of gold running vertically through a steep canyon ridge approximately 5 miles from the Colorado River. Miners worked the Tecaticup's tunnels under conditions that tested endurance in every respect. In 1861, workers discovered the salvage vein, a rich ribbon of gold running vertically through a steep canyon ridge approximately 5 miles from the Colorado River. They began at the top of the ridge and cut downward into the vein, following it deeper and deeper into the earth as they extracted ore. Eventually, the mine contained a dozen separate tunnel levels, with the deepest accessible only through a long access passage cut 500 feet below the surface. The ore they extracted went to Colorado City by mule, onto steamboats heading south to Yuma, and then overland to San Francisco, where it became currency in a civilized economy that had no idea where it came from or what it had cost. In 1864, the canyon's first stamp mill appeared near the steamboat landing. This 10-stamp, steam-driven facility processed raw ore from the surrounding mines before shipping it downstream. The mill's appearance signaled that the canyon's mining operations had achieved enough stability and profitability to justify permanent infrastructure investment, but permanent infrastructure didn't bring permanent law. The mill processed gold while men continued settling disputes with firearms. The canyon attracted two figures whose violence exceeded even what the miners inflicted on each other. A man named Avot terrorized the surrounding region and killed 5 settlers in the area before authorities managed to stop him. In 1897, Avot entered the camp of a man named Charles Nelson, one of the canyon's established residents, and killed Nelson along with 4 others in a single incident. The surviving community renamed their settlement Nelson in somber acknowledgement of the massacre. The town's name wasn't chosen to honor a founder or commemorate a founding moment. It was chosen to remember a killing. This was a community whose most meaningful act of civic identity was naming itself after a murder. A second figure named Quejo operated through the canyon, committing violence that persisted for years. Quejo was a Cocopah man who became Nevada's most wanted fugitive, pursued relentlessly by Sheriff Pasas through the canyon's rocky terrain and desert passages. Quejo understood the landscape better than any posse member and used that knowledge to disappear after each incident. He moved through the canyon's labyrinthine passages and outcroppings with complete familiarity, while his pursuers navigated unfamiliar ground. Despite sustained pursuits spanning years, Quejo was never captured. Between 1864 and the turn of the century, Eldorado Canyon's mines produced an estimated $10 million in gold and silver. The Tecaticup contributed the largest share of that production, extracting wealth from tunnels that workers had risked their lives to dig, while ownership disputes raged above ground. The Nelson mining district dotted the canyon landscape with numerous operations. The Gettysburg, Duncan, Solar, Rand, Wall Street, Swobe, and Golden Empire mines all extracted ore from the same canyon walls that the Tecaticup had proven contained extraordinary wealth. The Tecaticup's ownership eventually consolidated under men with sufficient capital to develop it properly. Senator George Hearst of California, father of publisher William Randolph Hearst, owned the mine at one point during its productive years. By 1883, the operation had grown substantial enough to justify constructing a private 15-stamp mill, eliminating the expense of transporting raw ore to outside processing facilities. The mine that had begun through disputed dealings and sustained itself through decades of violence had become a legitimate industrial operation, generating serious wealth for serious investors. The canyon's population declined as the most accessible ore played out. The deserters who had flooded in during the Civil War aged, died, or drifted elsewhere as the conflict they'd fled became distant history. The men who replaced them were professional miners rather than fugitives, but the isolation and the absence of law that had characterized the canyon from its beginning remained constant. When Nelson's Landing on the Colorado River finally ceased operations after railroad construction made steamboat transport obsolete in the early 1900s, the canyon lost its primary connection to outside markets. The settlements that had existed to support mining operations contracted steadily. Nelson, the town named after a massacre victim, survived as the canyon's last inhabited point, sustained by continued mining in diminishing quantities. By the time the Cattecup mine finally ended production, Eldorado Canyon had extracted its wealth and spent its violence. The structures left standing in Nelson weathered under Nevada desert sun. Equipment rusted in the dry air. The tunnels sat dark and silent, their walls still bearing the marks of 40 years of blasting powder and human determination. What those walls witnessed across those 4 decades was the full reality of what the American frontier could become when wealth appeared and law didn't follow. Not the romantic frontier of popular mythology, not the adventurous west of dime novels, but a place where the nearest sheriff was a week's ride away, where murder became ordinary, where a town named itself after the men who died there, because there was nothing more honest it could say about its own history. Eldorado Canyon was everything the Wild West promised and everything it threatened. The gold was real. The violence was real. And the silence that eventually settled over Nelson was the only verdict that place ever received.